The opening sequence of episode 66 picks up right where we left off, with old Porcupine trying to chomp on Aaron's nape, but being promptly stopped by Levi. But one thing that I love here in the context of this episode is Porco's "how can a bunch of humans charge right at me with the intent to kill" being slightly recontextualized. Obviously, the previous episode already dealt with a bunch of very, very bad things coming from Paradis. But with this episode in particular, I think this serves as a very potent reminder that beneath all the Titan craziness, this is all just people. The Titans and everything else, these are just tools to carry out this mass violence, but at the end of the day, all of this entire cycle of hatred, it is just people. Considering how much of this episode would be told from the perspective of Marley, and just how much death Paradis would cause, I think is just a brilliant reflection of humanity's capacity for good, but also the worst kinds of things imaginable, even coming from the people we followed for the better part of 3 seasons. We know a lot of them are very good people, but in this, not so much. But suddenly, we pivot as the car arrives and the scouts charging at it are just obliterated. The music here is once again just excellent. We just went through all of those emotional peaks of the scouts making their move and dominating the battleground. But now, we slide down into the valley as there's this terrifying moment of doubt for Jean. They are all seasoned soldiers, sure, but they will still be overwhelmed by the brutality of just all-out war. Peak then does a bit of a lore drop about our cool new machine gun, but what I love here is that all of this is again just a iterative advancement specifically designed to work against the ODM gear. Just like we saw with the scouts incorporating what they've learned to take down Rod, and like we're also seeing with the new ODM gear, after getting absolutely destroyed back in Shiganshina, they were forced to adapt. If air superiority was one of Marley's biggest fears, well then Paradis is already a micro-scale example of that. They just rain down on the Titans and it's kinda GG's. Lots of series struggle with power escalation, but I think Attack on Titan approached it in a super realistic and down-to-earth way, which I really enjoyed. All of it is just tiny incremental advancements that don't really change much, but when they all sum up, it's a pretty big difference. And what I also really enjoy is the scene of Eren getting impaled again. The Warhammer creating this grotesque, almost melting wax-like structure. And the way the music is leveraged here accentuates all of that even further. Just like last episode where I constantly likened the episode to a dance, here we see something very similar. When Eren is impaled, the music just keeps going. There isn't a dramatic sting or a shift in tone or anything really, in large part because it has no real effect on Eren. This is it, she is burned through her stamina and the fight has basically been decided. But as we all know, this is Liberio, so after the briefest moments of silence, we suddenly hear lumbering footsteps in the distance and the music kicks right back in. Everyone, both friend and foe, look up at Zeke as this ultimate judge of what's to come. And here, there are 2 separate things to deconstruct. Firstly, I want to again stress just how absurd this spiral of escalation is and how well all of that translates to screen. I keep using this meme, but like, it's not even a meme, that literally happens in the space of 2 episodes in like 10 minutes in real time. Even comparing this to something like the basement reveal, which was cooked up for the better part of 3 seasons, Liberio still stands out just because of how tightly the narrative is written, which is even further strengthened by the fact that our perspective is constantly being challenged. Most of this insane downward spiral does not happen from Paradis' point of view. With every single point of escalation, the series will ask us, will you draw the line at civilian casualties? Will you draw the line at Flock willingly targeting civilians? Will you draw the line at just helpless kids being caught up in this? Where will you draw that line? In just a couple of episodes, we go from the scouts being the unequivocal heroes of the story to a lot more uncomfortable questions of what is war and which side, if any, can you truly justify? But number 2, I talk about Zeke being built up as this ultimate arbiter coming to just kind of clean up the situation, but keep in mind, he is one shot in a few minutes. All of that setup, all of that gravitas was completely cut short. But instead of it seeming like a waste of time and a disappointment, I think it just further adds to the breakneck chaos that we are witnessing. Just like with Eren animation canceling the Warhammer, this too is kinda like, yeah, this is like really bad, we don't know what's going on, so we will break a lot of rules. I also love this contrasting of Zeke's wipe them all out and Levi's don't die. On one side, we have the quote-unquote honorary warriors just protecting their home, and on the other side, we have the Devils of Paradis. But they are all just human, and their leader doesn't tell them to wipe out anything. He tells them to just live. And well, isn't that a conundrum? The supposed heroes are all the ones using those devilish titan forms and literally saying, "Go scorched earth." This is Marley's colonialism, one which is predicated on wipe them out. And what stands against them is nothing more than the survival of Paradis. But that's not true either now, is it? This assault is done by Paradis, and the destruction they bring is very, very close to Zeke's wipe them all out. So again, it's all about forcing the audience to start asking themselves, how far is too far? Are they still just the oppressed nation who has every right to fight back? Or are they already just perpetuating the cycle of violence that started this in the first place? That aside though, this shot is absolutely excellent. Unlike Shiganshina, where Levi comes in as the predator in full control of the situation, this episode frames Zeke as so overbearing that he doesn't even fit into the frame. Instead, he's this awkward mass taking up almost half the screen. The extreme close-up on Zeke's fingers creating this almost visceral sense of his presence and the threat he poses. Even the movement, juxtaposing Levi shooting into the entirely static brick wall that is Zeke, even further builds up that this is going to be a very, very different fight. Yeah, no, let's stop goofing around. Literally all of them are cooked in the space of like 10 minutes. It's actually insane. As for the title of the episode, Assault, I think this one is pretty self-explanatory. The only thing I want to focus on here is that this of course references the Scouts. For the first time in the series, this is a proactive campaign against Marley on their own territory. Something that seemed nigh impossible barely 10 episodes earlier. Reclaiming Shiganshina is one thing. Striking at the core of Marley's alliance, that is a whole different story. Moving into the episode, we see Falco emerge from Reiner's protective shell thingy, with the only thing in sight being just onslaughts. Quick thing before we start yapping about Falco, the continuous one-take shot here is incredible and I think really captures how chaotic what we're seeing is. We zip around the cart, across the beast, up against the jaw, it's just never ending. Yes, the CG textures do sometimes look very flat, but it's give and take, right? This kind of stuff in 2D just isn't possible on a realistic budget, so I will gladly take this. And unlike Witch, they also have the big buff of this happening in like very close quarters and it being nighttime so they can hide a lot of the imperfections, whereas with Witch, well, you can pretty clearly see where the model was just copy-pasted over and over. As for Falco, he mumbles to himself that that must be Mr. Kruger, but immediately correcting himself saying, no, it's Eren Yeager, and then just asking, how dare you? First off, I view a lot of what we see in Liberio as a sort of an inversion of episode 60 for him. He is not the invader. This is his home being invaded by people that are just like him. People who too were unfairly oppressed for so long that they might inadvertently be continuing the cycle that they wish to stop. But at the same time, and understandably so, there is a degree of hatred and anger, with him specifically singling out Eren, who betrayed his trust. He was the one who brought this upon them, and he burdened Falco and Falco alone with all of this death. But with Falco, the interplay between this understanding that they are people just like him, and that visceral, primal hatred is very, very different. Unlike a vast majority of characters in the story, he is never corrupted by the world. A lot of the time in fiction, you'll have these tragic backstories to explain how villains became villains, or at the very least, why they did villainous things. Attack on Titan is no exception, with basically everyone in the story largely being reflections of the wrongdoing inflicted upon them. One of the biggest tragedies and consistent themes in the story is the oppressed becoming the oppressors. And the same thing should apply to Falco. He has every reason to be cold and jaded. From the moment he was born, he was oppressed. He worked himself to the bone trying to become a warrior. He, a literal kid, ran into machine guns. And even when he met the kind Mr. Kruger who finally seemed to connect with him on a personal level, he betrayed him and brought upon the wrath of an entire nation. But in the face of all that, he is never corrupted. He doesn't hate Paradis, nor does he really hate Marley. Even if he doesn't really understand it, he implicitly knows that it's the systems and the regimes that allowed it to spiral out of control, not individuals. And I think this understanding and compassion is demonstrated beautifully right here. Mere moments after condemning Eren, he remembers about Reiner, and all of that anger disappears in an instant. Saving lives will always take precedence over vengeance. Later in the episode, he even jumps in front of a Thunder Spear in an attempt to save Peak. All of which is of course beautifully contrasted by Gabby, who is currently running around with a rifle and who literally forgot about Reiner. Now, there is of course a whole separate tangent to be had here around him being naive. This is a full-on assault team, and it's really bad. Now is not really the time for big dreams. But in terms of ideals and in terms of values, Falco is clearly a carer, and getting his own home invaded, just like he had done before, I think just strengthens that ideal. And that is also echoed with him stepping up to Reiner and realizing that the reason why he's not regenerating is because he has no purpose to live. Despite the horrors outside, despite all the death his allies are seeing, Falco understands that pushing Reiner, it would be cruel. Unlike most other characters in this series, Falco is one of the rare few who actually saw what this cycle eventually leads to. He saw the supposedly honorary Marley and Reiner, the supposed hero of Marley, just break down. He heard Eren recount his story, and like we talked about a few episodes prior, Marley's entire story just doesn't add up. And so, he just tries comforting Reiner, and just begs him to hold out a little longer while he gets help. TLDR, Falco is a very nice guy, and quite frankly, it's a miracle he survived the series. In the meantime, we see scouts zipping around Zeke's Snape and instantly being smoothified. Keep in mind that the conspiracy with Zeke is a closely guarded secret that only the top-level scouts are aware of. We'll leave all the politics for when we get there because there are literally like 5 plans going on in tandem, but a lot of the scouts' deaths here are quite frankly completely pointless. It was a secret, and so a lot of them genuinely believe that there is a big battle and well, they got themselves killed for nothing, which is very sad. We also get a few interior shots of the machine gun armor thingy, where we see a few pictures of their squad and also just Peak. While it might seem a little funny that they're all just thirsty boys, I do think it's a small detail to create even stronger emotional resonance for, you know, when they're turned into fireworks. Even if it is a little played up for the goofs, there clearly was a bond there. And to be fair, tank crews in World War II also kept pictures and other mementos in the tank, so it's also realistic. Finally returning to Eren, he says that the crystal is the same as Annie's, but then adds that it's clear that she has used up all of her strength since the spike barely put a scratch on his breast. I mentioned it briefly last time, but it's really hard to dissect the Warhammer's abilities because we just don't know how experienced Laura was with it. She absolutely dominated the battle in the initial stages, so it does seem kinda OP by default. Yes, there is the argument that Eren didn't even know what the power was, so he was going in blind, but even so, the battle was so extremely one-sided to the point of not even seeming particularly taxing for Laura. But then again, in barely a few minutes, she is completely out of stamina, which then begs the question of, did she A, overexert herself way too quickly and that's why it was so ludicrously powerful, B, is she just not properly trained in combat and so her stamina is simply not there, and the entire fight was just carried by the raw strength of the Warhammer, or C, is it a mixture of the two and the Warhammer is just naturally incredibly taxing? In his fight against Reiner, Eren would use it pretty liberally, but it was still nowhere near as much as Laura did right here. I mean, she went through a couple Warhammers, a sword, a crossbow, a couple of big spear pillar thingies, floor spikes, and whatever else in the space of 5 minutes. And also keep in mind that she was blasted by Mikasa multiple different times to the point of actually being knocked down. If it's the creation of sheer mass that drains her stamina, the pillars alone should be equivalent to like 5 full body transformations, like the pillars are massive. Realistically, I don't see how Laura would have gotten much combat experience, both due to their secrecy as well as because, well, who is she going to fight? But it's really impossible to say. She could have trained with weapons in her human form and that might translate into, like, actual weapon use in the same way that we see Eren copy Annie's stance. Not to descend into fictional science again, when Isayama writes the Song of Man and Titan, I expect the main character to have the Warhammer Titan because it's like the coolest Titan ever, thank you very much. And what is also the coolest thing ever is Eren playing his reverse Uno and transforming for a 3rd time. Something we have never seen before, neither with Eren or with any other Titan shifter. Because I have a PhD in Yapology, I did try to compare whether his third form is somehow skinnier or less bulky than the others, because on first glance, at least to me, it definitely seemed like it was, especially this part right here. His muscle mass looks mostly the same, but the upper rib cage looks like it has like zero fat whatsoever. Or however you describe it. I'm not a doctor, okay? It just looks skinnier. I'm pretty sure it would be like fat because that's the first thing that goes, right? When he was still training with Hanji, it seemed to follow a similar pattern, where the muscles around his nape formed fine, but they were less developed, and eventually the transformation just, like, completely stopped. That being said though, the differences are nowhere near big enough for any concrete conclusion, and I am like 99% certain it's the same exact 3D model, so me thinks that this is indeed the titular overanalysis. And if it is indeed the same exact transformation, well then 3 full Titan forms, all of which he uses in combat in the space of like 10 minutes in real time? That's insane! What was bro eating for these past 4 years? He is built different. What is definitely not overanalysis though, is Peak saying old Porkchop has nothing to worry about, and that they don't even need to be on the offensive, saying we control the entire battlefield. Conceptually, this is 100% true. Eren is currently soloing 4, or at the very least 3 if you exclude the Warhammer, Titan Shifters, and the Paradis military is about to be encircled with literally everything Marley has. Under any normal circumstances, and by normal circumstances we mean Marley's military strategy type of deal because they don't really know about the ODM gear. Well, they do know about the ODM gear, but they don't really know how it's being used. Paradis should have literally 0 chance. Problem is, Peak has made a wee bit of a miscalculation. One of those being, you know, that little thing called the Colossal Titan that can kinda sorta instantly vaporize any blockade they have set up? And in hindsight, we obviously also know that Zeke, he is not fighting to win. And that's not to mention Marley's military has also been infiltrated. So, in reality, it isn't Marley who is sitting back and just waiting to win by default. It's Paradis. All the necessary pieces are now in play. The only thing they're waiting for is their ticket out of Liberio. And the funny thing here is Zeke complimenting Peak for putting it all together, since that's exactly what he wants them to think. His plan has already gone off the rails by Porco and Peak even being here. So the next best thing is if they just think that everything is under control and just don't do anything. But Zeke then notes that Eren is not his opponent, instead calling for a rematch with Levi. Obviously the whole "you're running out of time" and Levi literally checking the time and all of that are clues that this is just theater. Some overanalyzers might even say that Willie's play never ended and he was just the tragic Act 2 twist. Considering how Zeke would later talk about how they had to make the act convincing, I have always wondered what he actually envisioned here and whether he actually wanted to challenge Levi. Not to try to win or anything, obviously the plan was still the most important thing, but just to entertain this little grudge they have for one another. And speaking of Lil Beyblade Man, as we see Falco running to safety, he knows that Zeke is unstoppable, obviously assuming that their savior is finally here. Goofs aside, the really interesting part is what happens when he runs into Magath. He immediately tries telling him about Reiner, but Magath just grabs him, asking whether he's been hurt. Magath's reaction here isn't strategic or militaristic. The entire Eldian Devil narrative is gone completely. All that remains is concern for a little innocent kid who was brainwashed to join some made-up war. And in the context of this episode, I think it also works to contrast Paradis and Marley. Against the background of this very bloody assault, this moment of basic human empathy really captures the cruel but beautiful message that is Attack on Titan. And at the same time, I think it also illustrates a bit of a paradox in how Magath perceives war. When they were on the assaults, Gabby and Falco were soldiers just like the rest. But throughout this episode, we see him repeatedly do everything in his power just to make sure that they are safe. Not in a "we are retreating" sense, but in a "these are children whose homes just got blown up" sense. And yet another beautiful point of contrast here is with Falco again just saying that they must help Reiner, saying it was Eren Yeager who tricked them and attacked them. And right as he says this, we cut to Gabby, for whom vengeance is the only thing she cares about. We then cut to the port, where the Navy is prepping troops, but almost right away, they spot a fishing boat. And just as quickly, we see Armin remove the hood. And oh boy, I don't think I will ever forget my reaction watching this, because the moment I saw the boat, it all just instantly clicked for me. This is their trump card, and it's gonna be really, really bad. With his teeth clenched, lightning zaps around him, and the sky lights up. I think the single greatest decision Isayama made here is having all of this happen during nighttime. Seeing the dead of night instantly turn into blinding sunlight is horrifying. And the Navy just literally evaporating then and there is so messed up. And then seeing this apocalyptic beacon just cutting the sky in two definitely blurs the line between our good buddy Armin and the same monster who broke open the walls. The scene of Falco, Gabby, and Magath getting caught up in the explosion even emulates the reactions and subsequent shockwave that we saw in Shiganshina. The track that plays here is titled This. I'm not gonna read it out. Yes, it's another classic Attack on Titan name. But it's a rearrangement of the classic Attack on Titan, aka the Colossal's theme, and XLTT, which, big surprise, is a slightly different version of the Attack on Titan track. The XLTT is like the actual Colossal appearance theme, by the way, but they are very, very similar. But point is, just like a few episodes prior, it's sounding for Eren, the track being used for our side and Armin's Colossal is yet another wake-up moment that the series we've been watching thus far is nowhere near as simple as the quote-unquote good guys fighting for freedom. Even the events of Liberio start to drift right back into that cycle of hatred that started this whole ordeal to begin with. And the Colossal's nuke here, even though it is largely a military objective, is just this horrifying act of terror that everyone, including the civilians, do see. To lighten the mood a little, we cut to our resident genius Porco, whose reaction to Armin's transformation is, and I quote, "I knew they didn't come here without a plan." Which, yes, lil Porky boy, thank you for your valuable input. Had it not been for your valuable input, I would have thought the hundreds of units all appearing at the same time with synchronized, systematic attacks on our crucial points of resistance was just a coincidence. I would have almost thought that they forgot the Colossal Titan back at home. Thank you, Porkchop, for your valuable military insight. Okay, to be fair to Porco, there was no guarantee that they didn't just kill Baking Spray, so they didn't know that Paradis for sure had the Colossal Titan. Actually, on second thought, we don't need to be fair to Porco because he's a goofy goober. His next reaction is randomly jumping into the battlefield completely alone, which is then immediately followed by Levi one-shotting Zeke with absolutely no resistance whatsoever. I touched on this already, but I do wonder whether this completely meaningless, sudden, and abrupt defeat with zero buildup whatsoever was just another tool to convey how Paradis is dominating the battlefield right now. Obviously, it was easy because it's fake. Zeke never put up any kind of fight. But still, just how abrupt it feels does give you a bit of a vibe check. And speaking of, the shot of Gabby, Falco, and Magath just watching in disbelief as Levi casually blows open Zeke's nape is also very, very spooky. Our perspective has largely followed Falco in this episode, but at every single turn, another pillar, another wall that kept them safe just keeps crumbling down. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nowhere is safe. This assault is just overbearing. Even the music here accentuates this sense of futility on Marley's side, all culminating in Sasha shooting the machine gun operator. I distinctly remember watching this episode for the first time and genuinely asking myself the question of, why do I feel kinda bad for the machine gun dude, and really just about everyone else here? Now having rewatched the series countless times, I think the source of that is just how futile this resistance seems. Paradoxically, the complete chaos caused by Reiner and Bertolt and Shiganshina somehow seemed calmer than this meticulous deconstruction of Marley's military. They swing in and operate with genuinely frightening precision. There's been years in between, we don't really know what they're capable of, we don't really know who they are anymore. After a certain point, it really is like, okay, that's enough, you won. And if you think about it from the perspective of the average Marleyan soldier, remember that most of them have completely bought into their propaganda. They genuinely believe these are devils who have come to destroy just everything. It's really, really spooky and frankly amazing that you could pull off an emotion like this in a series where the protagonist was brutally oppressed for a full 3 seasons. The fact that you can even entertain questions like this, I think just demonstrates how strong the initial Reiner arc is, and how you do begin to realize that both sides, to varying degrees, are just victims. But again, it keeps going, with Jean then jumping in and absolutely demolishing Peak's armor. Music mentioned 500, but I think it's again, it just never stopping that gives the scene this sense of helplessness, because there is no need to accentuate anything. It's done, there is no more decision moment, no more action, they've completely lost. Now, we are just witnessing the tragedy unfold. It is genuinely the becoming uncanny meme. And like with everything else, P crashes down right beside Magath. 10 out of 10 cinema, I love this. The Midcard talks about the new and upgraded ODM gear. Not much else to say here aside from that same innovation angle I mentioned with Peak. It's cool that most of these advancements really just come from reverse engineering the equipment of the Kenny squad and later the Red 9s brought by Yelena. And if we were to use a little bit of future memories, it's also very cool that the old ODM gear isn't just completely forgotten because power creep. They still have all of those legacy kits and we'd actually see them in action as well. Returning to the episode, we open with just a hellscape of fire, broken, contorted hands sticking through the rubble. The sound design of these almost distorted sounding footsteps along with this imagery is just chilling. You literally can't tell where the water was, where the town was, or anything. All there is just this unnatural, hellish red light as Armin marches forward. And we then get the fire line of, "So this is what you saw that day, Bertolt." Before we get to the genius transition to Falco, I want to dwell a bit more on Armin being the one to inherit the Colossal. Back in Season 3, he shot one of Kenny's assassins to save Jean's life. And even with everyone thanking him for bloodying his hands for them, he was obviously very deeply disturbed. Armin is not a warrior. He's not weak or blind to the reality of violence, but even while operating in a military capacity, he is a people person first and foremost. He will talk, he will negotiate, he will strategize. He'll push other psyches with horrible lies. He'll even offer himself as a hostage. But actually hurting someone is just something he cannot justify. And so him inheriting the Titan that can instantly vaporize thousands of lives, all the while carrying the burden of being chosen over Erwin, is like the single most messed up thing Isayama could have ever written. As we talked about with them reaching the sea, holding onto that simple seashell was all Armin ever wanted. To share that joy with Eren and Mikasa, to finally live instead of just surviving. But after this, can he ever live with himself? Armin is someone who intellectualizes his problems. And no matter how you shake it, Armin and Bertolt are one and the same. Both of them were oppressed kids pushed into war, and both of them killed thousands of innocent lives who have done nothing wrong. When it comes to his conscience, he couldn't care less about this being a military goal. Just like we saw with him still feeling disturbed over a, let's be honest here, very straightforward case of him defending himself and his friend against someone who would have killed them, it still matters that he took that life. What if they could have been reformed? What about their parents? What about their loved ones? What's going to happen with everyone who will miss that life? This would be paid off brilliantly later in the season with Armin actually resorting to violence, but put a pin in that for now, because the cinema is not over. Right as Armin calls to Bertolt, we abruptly smash cut to Falco. I think we've already had more than enough instances of Paradis, and especially Eren, doing unspeakable things that frankly begin to alienate us from their cause. But this one with Falco is a punch to the gut for sure. When Armin calls to Bertolt, it's a bit of a cocktail of emotions. There is sorrow and almost understanding for Bertolt. But there is also horror, because he remembers being just like Falco, begging for it all to be over. He remembers watching the Colossal's hand crush the wall. He knows that pain. He knows how it felt to lose his entire family, to lose his humanity just to survive. So how can he stand there doing the same exact thing? As the other side of the sea fades in, Falco stands in front of Peak, begging and crying for Jean not to kill her. But this is Season 4, and the other side of the sea is playing, so no, there is no pause, and Jean fires anyway. Now, there is the question of what caused him to miss. Was it just Peak's steam, or did he hesitate? My interpretation is very spicy, I know, it's a mix of both. First off, he literally pulled the trigger, meaning he accepted whatever risk might come to Falco. But at the same time, there is a degree of, no wait. We'd also later see this with him going against Flock's orders. So essentially, I think it's a moment of hesitation that gave Peak just enough time to regain consciousness, and so the shot missed. But still, let's not get lost in the sauce. This was absolutely horrible. Compared to someone like Floch, Jean is obviously a bastion of morality. But even he will give up on mercy when everything around them is going up in flames. He did pull the trigger, there is no debating that. And that does kinda make me sad. Also, Louise is back, so the scout propaganda has very much worked. Almost reminds me of someone else who kept looking up to these so-called warriors and legendary soldiers of their nation. More on Louise soon TM. Aaron swatting Porco out of the air goes really hard, and Porco's swishy swooshy attack that rips up his hand is also really cool. But the more important thing here is Mikasa noting that he is totally different from Ymir's jaw. Let's not get lost in the fictional science sauce that is the warrior candidate picking process, because we've already done that many times. No, seriously, I get that Ymir's jaw titan was supposed to be super scrappy, but Ymir, and not Ymir herself, but the actual Ymir did her real dirty. What I want to talk about is the hardness of all of these materials. Because how do the walls stack up against the Titan hardening, and how does that stack up against the armored plates, and that against the Titan cocoon, and that against the crystal catacomb pillars, and that against the Warhammer's hardening, and that against the jaw? Most of the stuff I just mentioned seems to be identical. Like we saw with Annie, the Titan hardening can go through the walls, and like we saw with Aaron's weird crystallization thingy, the pillars did also collapse. So it seems like those are basically the same thing. But is it just the jaw that is harder than all of those things? Or maybe the Warhammer, with a bolt or something, can also shoot through it? And what about the Colossal? What if Armin stepped on the shell? What if he squeezed it in his hand? And also, isn't there the thing of a human tooth can take 30,000 pounds or something of force? So, okay, Aaron can bite through the shell, but what about Armin's Colossal? I would assume his teeth are even bigger. We need to run the numbers of how much force a Titan of Armin's mass could exert in his hand, and then we need to come up with a lore reason of why he didn't try to break open Annie's crystal. For now, we'll write it off to Armin realizing that it is in fact a possibility, but he really liked yapping to Annie, so he never told about it to anyone. I mean, you can't blame him, bro had a crush that was probably strengthened by the crush of the dude he ate. Sounds so ridiculous, oh my god. Also, shout out to the editor who kept using this shriek in the music to basically say, game over. As we get to Gabby and Falco, we get another excellent bit of contrasting. Gabby, finally, remembers about Reiner, but Falco just says that maybe we should just let him be. He saw firsthand just how disturbed Reiner was, and he understands that the only thing he needs now is help. But that doesn't compute for Gabby, at all. And to be honest, you can't blame her. Even if she doesn't actually know about Reiner's trauma, the split between knowing Reiner shouldn't fight and him having to fight is the paradox that is at the heart of Attack on Titan. Right now, morality and help is a privilege they cannot afford. Both of these things are true at the same time. But before they can land on a conclusion, we hear buzzing in the air as the airship starts coming in. I've mentioned this many times before, but this is why we had that whole airship drop-in escapade back in episode 60. It was just a very neat way to remind us of the technology that exists in the world, as we haven't really touched upon it since Grisha's flashback. As we get to the inside of the airship, we reunite with Hanji and our new buddy Onyankopon. And if you were wondering where they got the airship, well then here's your answer. He is in a Marleyan uniform and everyone on Paradis was white, so this is definitely someone from beyond the sea and from a completely different culture. And also, he's someone with the know-how and the ability to yoink and then pilot the ship. And also, he addresses Hanji by just Hanji, so this is a first name basis and he is definitely a buddy. But Hanji then turns to Armin saying he comes up with the craziest ideas, then asking whether Erwin's ghost has possessed him. First off, I think this was a deliberate jab at the audience who was most likely and is still fuming about Armin being chosen. Normally, you would assume that these plans were a collaborative effort and maybe Armin played a part in them. But yeah no, Hanji straight up says this was his plan and it's a very good plan that has very minimal casualties. And speaking of, number 2, Armin didn't even know what an airship was. But he cooked up a plan with a pseudo-runway that's not actually a runway, but he kind of invents a runway that swoops in from the only position Marley literally couldn't defend and where they have complete superiority, the air. This is Armin identifying their single weakest link and constructing an entire plan around that with technology and just all kinds of variables that he didn't even know existed. But of course, something big happening means Porco has something new to fume about, and so he goes to leap off the roof, and this time, he doesn't even make it to the ground. Mikasa immediately cuts his legs off and sends him barreling toward his final destination, that is Eren. As the music swells, comes the final, very brutal beatdown, and eventually, the Nutcracker. To say the scene is a mixture of emotions would be the understatement of the century, because how should you feel? On one hand, you expect something, anything, to happen, but nothing ever does. It's as if time has stopped and everyone is just watching in disbelief. There is no one left to fight Eren, and to show us that, after he gets the Warhammer, with a very cool close-up on his eye dilating ever so slightly, it's a very cool shot by the way, the music cuts out completely. Eren, now wielding a third Titan, just keeps bashing Porco over and over and over. Let's be real, most of us were still on the Scouts' side, but this victory is somehow tainted and somehow dark. Before I spiral out of control with my gushing, I want to talk about the mechanics of stealing the Warhammer. Let me preface this by saying, this is kind of a pointless conversation, I do admit. It's all just fantasy shenanigans, and frankly, that's all there is to it. But saying that, how much spinal fluid do you need to capture the Titan? Surely Porco would have gotten some in his mouth as well. I mean, he literally crushed it. But most of the juice flows down to Eren because of that great thing called gravity. And at least with the animation we see, he gets a few good pretty big gulps, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why is there so much? But anyway, let's roll with it. So, is there some kind of threshold you need to cross which constitutes acquiring the Titan? Obviously, it would have to be more than half so that the same Titan can be split in two, which I assume someone at some point must have tried. But let's say you dilute it between 4 different people and they never get it. Does it just automatically respawn in a random Eldian? I would assume so, right? Okay, let's be real, like I said, it is all just fantasy stuff, that's all there is to it. But to engage in a bit more fantasy shenanigans, can we also talk about how, in an alternate world, Eren could have gotten the jaw and just went to find Peak next? Peak is completely out of commission. All he has to do is just find her. Eren wielding 5 Titans would make for a very, very different War for Parody, that much is certain. But as Gabby just begins screaming for Reiner to save them, we cut to Reiner, who just mutters, "Please, just this once. Why can't you just let me die in peace?" If for this entire episode we've talked about how there is almost no hope and that it's just non-stop destruction by the Scouts, then I think this scene right here does spark this weird amount of hope. They actually managed to call to their savior. Granted, he is definitely no savior, but the shot of him transforming and stopping this bloodshed, I think is still beautiful. Especially when rewatching the story and knowing where Eren's story leads and really knowing where the entire story leads, it is this constant emotional pendulum of me sort of feeling bad for Reiner, but then I'm like, no, Eren was the one who was oppressed, but then Reiner was oppressed as well. There just is no right way to feel about this. And that is exactly what makes it peak cinema. Story-wise though, this is a very important point of reference for what we see from this point onward. Reiner was done here. Actually, 100% completely done. Eren could have yoinked the armor for all he cared. But just like with Falco hitting the wall moments before he pulled the trigger, he remembers that he still has them. No matter how much he hates himself, and no matter how tired he is, he still has them. And that alone is worth fighting for. If they call, the cool Uncle Reiner will come marching in. Any place, anytime, always. That is what he does. He keeps marching through that hell over and over, hoping that, at the end, there is something different. Also, we'll talk about it a bit more next time, but people got super hyped when the episode first dropped, and even now people say this. This right here is not something that was forgotten or a big plot hole or whatever else, because this is not a cool new Reiner Titan form. Yes, the spiky shoulders do look super menacing, but really, they're just jagged because the formation of his plates doesn't actually wrap around him. This weird-looking form that we have never seen and will never see again is just a incomplete transformation, and that's it. He literally doesn't want to live, so yeah, his Titan form will be all kinds of messed up, If you look at his arms, there are plates that are just half-formed, jagged edges, barely protecting anything. Especially on his legs, you can just see random bits of plate that have started to form, but there's like nothing there, it's just a random small thing. And most of all, his faceplate has also not formed. His entire mouth should be covered by a mouth guard, but there is nothing there. So yes, no, this is not the Armor Titan MK2, this is like the Armor Titan MK 0.5 Depressed Reiner Edition. And with that, that is episode 66. Yet another insane episode with far too many things going on, but is just so good. I've mentioned it quite a few times throughout this video and also the previous one, but my biggest takeaway from this episode is just how quickly our perspective begins to shift. For the most part, most of us would be like, yeah, the scouts are doing a lot of bad things, but like we sort of get it. But more and more, that line is definitely starting to blur, and I'm just amazed at how quickly that can happen. Also, this is not a sponsored segment, but this video is brought to you by Korotos Should Read the Manga Incorporated, because you remember how I ranted about the Attack Titan being immediately identified? It's because of this. Zeke just knows. I don't know how he knows, because it should still be like kind of a mystery, but in the manga he just knows. That's it. But anyway, with all that being said, next time it is time for the end of this little raid on Liberio, and one of the most controversial events in the entire series. So, I hope to see you back as we continue overanalyzing Attack on Titan. And that's the video. Way too much yappers has already happened, but I hope you enjoyed the slightly earlier episode this week. The usual reminder about live streams and everything else I do, all of those links are in the description, and if you never want to miss like anything I do, join the Discord, I have everything automated there, you will never miss anything. Other than that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Ellie Fawn. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.